The first time Sarah heard it, she thought it was just the house settling. A faint, rhythmic scratching, so soft it could have been a trick of her overtired mind. She shifted under the covers, exhaling slowly, willing herself back to sleep. But then it came again. A persistent scrape, scrape, scrape. She opened her eyes in the dark, pulse quickening. For a moment she lay still, listening. The sound was coming from the living room. Sarah slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, asleep in the adjacent room. Wrapping her robe around herself, she padded barefoot down the hall, the cool hardwood sending a shiver up her spine. The living room was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Her eyes swept the space, searching for the source of the noise. And then she saw him. Max, her golden retriever, was crouched near the far wall, his paws working furiously at the plaster. His ears were pinned back, tail stiff, body taut with focus. "Max?" she called softly. He didn't react. Sarah frowned, stepping closer. "Hey, what are you doing?" She reached out, running a hand down his back, feeling the tension beneath his golden fur. He let out a low whine, pressing his nose against the wall, inhaling sharply before resuming his frantic clawing. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. She crouched beside him, pressing a palm to the wall. Cool. Solid. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, Max continued, his nails scraping against the paint, leaving behind faint, jagged marks. "Enough," she murmured, gripping his collar. He resisted, straining forward, his whole body trembling with urgency. What the hell was he so fixated on? With effort, she pulled him away, dragging him toward his dog bed. He let out a low growl, one of frustration rather than aggression, but finally relented, settling with a disgruntled huff. Even as she turned off the light and headed back to bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, she tried to push it out of her mind. It was probably just mice in the walls. The house was old, after all. She made a mental note to call an exterminator, then went about her routine, getting Lily ready for school, tackling the never-ending pile of work emails, folding laundry that had sat in the basket for days. But that evening, as she finished washing dishes, it happened again. The unmistakable sound of scratching. Her breath caught. She turned slowly, dish towel still in hand. Max was back at the wall, his body rigid, his paws furiously scraping at the same spot as before. Sarah's skin prickled. This wasn't normal. "Max, stop," she commanded, her voice firmer this time. Nothing. A deep unease settled in her chest as she approached. She knelt beside him, pressing her ear against the wall. Silence. She knocked lightly. Hollow. Her stomach clenched. She pulled Max away again, but the retriever fought harder this time, twisting in her grip, his nails skittering against the hardwood. It took all her strength to drag him to the laundry room and shut the door behind him. From the other side, he barked sharply, a sound of protest. She exhaled, pressing her forehead against the door. Something was wrong. By the third night, Max had stopped eating. His bowl sat untouched in the kitchen, his usual excitement at mealtime replaced by restless pacing. He ignored Sarah's attempts to soothe him, his gaze flickering constantly to the wall, muscles coiled like a spring wound too tight. Lily noticed. "Why won't Max eat, Mommy?" she asked, hugging her stuffed bunny to her chest. Sarah forced a smile. "He's just being picky." Lily wrinkled her nose. "Max isn't picky." Sarah had no response. That night, she tucked Lily in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep tight, sweetheart." Lily yawned. "You too." Sarah turned off the light, leaving the door slightly ajar. She barely made it 2 steps down the hall before she heard her daughter's voice again, small, hesitant. "Mommy?" She turned. "Yes, baby?" Lily's eyes were wide, her fingers gripping the blanket. "I heard something." Sarah frowned. "Heard what?" Lily hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "A voice?" A cold weight settled in Sarah's chest. "A voice?" she repeated carefully. Lily nodded. "In the wall." The words sent a sharp chill down Sarah's spine. She forced a chuckle, kneeling by the bed. Sweetie, houses make noises. Sometimes wood creaks, or the pipes. Lily shook her head. No, Mommy. It was whispering. Sarah's throat went dry. Max let out a low growl from the hallway. Sarah turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The scratching had returned. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the wall. Max stood beside her, ears alert, every muscle in his body tense. Sarah swallowed hard. It's nothing. It's nothing. She knocked. Once. Twice. A pause. Then. Knock. Knock. Sarah's breath hitched. Her legs nearly gave out as she stumbled backward, hand flying to her mouth. No. No, she hadn't just heard that. Her body screamed for her to run, to grab Lily and leave the house, but she couldn't move. Max barked furiously, his body pressed against her leg. Then, a whisper. So faint, she almost convinced herself she imagined it. But she hadn't. Because Max had heard it too. His fur bristled, his body low and defensive. The whisper came again. Faint. Muffled. From inside the wall. Help me! Sarah's scream caught in her throat. Max lunged at the wall, barking wildly, his nails clawing at the plaster with renewed desperation. Sarah's heart pounded, her skin cold with fear. She turned on her heel, ran down the hall, and threw open Lily's door. Her daughter sat upright in bed, eyes wide. Sarah rushed forward, scooping her up, clutching her small body tightly. Max continued his assault on the wall, his growls deep and unrelenting. Sarah's mind spun. She needed help. She needed to get out. But even as she backed toward the door, holding Lily close, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside the wall, it wasn't finished with them yet. Sarah barely registered the cold air biting at her skin as she stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around Lily. The little girl clung to her, burying her face in her mother's neck, her small body trembling. Max stood rigid beside them, his ears alert, his growls rumbling low and constant. Sarah's fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone and dialed. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Sarah? She exhaled sharply. Daniel, I need you to come over. Now. A pause. Then, fully awake, what's wrong? She glanced back at the house, at the dimly lit window of the living room. At the wall. There's something in my house, she whispered. Daniel arrived in less than 10 minutes. He barely had time to step out of his truck before Sarah was ushering him inside. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, exhaustion finally winning over fear. Max sat beside her protectively, but the moment Daniel entered, the dog's head snapped toward the wall. His body stiffened. Daniel followed Sarah's gaze. That's where you heard it? She nodded. He approached, knocking firmly against the plaster. The sound echoed, hollow and thin. Sarah's arms tightened around herself. It knocked back. Daniel's brows furrowed. You're sure? She shot him a sharp look. I wouldn't make this up. He lifted his hands in surrender. Okay. He pressed his ear against the wall, stilling. For a long moment, nothing. Then, the faintest sound, so subtle Sarah wouldn't have caught it if she hadn't been listening for it. A shuffling. A whisper of movement. Daniel stepped back abruptly. Jesus? He ran a hand over his jaw, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. You sure this house doesn't have a crawl space or something behind this wall? No, Sarah said. It's solid. There shouldn't be anything back there. Max let out a low growl. Daniel exhaled. All right. We open it up. Sarah's stomach tightened. And if there's nothing? Daniel met her gaze. Then we patch it up, and you at least get some peace of mind? It sounded reasonable. But deep down, Sarah knew there would be something. Something was waiting. Daniel retrieved his toolbox from his truck, while Sarah carefully carried Lily upstairs, tucking her beneath the covers. She brushed a stray curl from her daughter's forehead, whispering soothing reassurances, though she wasn't sure who they were meant for, Lily or herself. When she returned to the living room, Daniel was already at work. He had cut into the wall, a section of plaster crumbling away to expose wooden beams. Dust clouded the air. Sarah hovered near the doorway, Max at her side. Daniel frowned, peering into the gap he had made. "There's a space back here." Sarah's pulse quickened. "That's not possible." Daniel shot her a look. "I'm telling you, there's a gap. A couple of feet deep, at least." He reached for his phone, flipping on the flashlight and angling it into the opening. His expression darkened. Sarah took a hesitant step closer. "What is it?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Then, in a slow, measured voice, he said, "There's something in there." Sarah's breath hitched. Daniel grabbed a crowbar and pried away another section of drywall, widening the hole. Dust and debris cascaded onto the floor, revealing the dark, narrow cavity beyond. And then they saw it. A small wooden box, nestled in the space like it had been deliberately placed there. Max whined, his ears pinned back. Daniel hesitated before reaching in. His fingers brushed against the rough surface, and he pulled it free. The box was old, the wood splintered and warped. It was no bigger than a shoebox, bound shut with rusted metal clasp. A strange sense of dread settled over Sarah. Daniel placed it carefully on the coffee table. Neither of them spoke. Finally, he exhaled. "You want to do the honors?" Sarah swallowed hard. With trembling fingers, she reached for the clasp. They were stiff with rust, resisting at first before snapping free with a sharp click. She lifted the lid. At first, all she saw was paper, old, yellowed, folded into a neat bundle. Beneath it, something else. Something small. She reached for the papers first, unfolding them carefully. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the words. It was a letter. A child's handwriting. "Please, if you find this, help me." Sarah's blood ran cold. She exchanged a glance with Daniel, then quickly unfolded the rest of the letter. "I don't know if anyone will ever find this. But if you do, please don't forget me. I don't want to be alone anymore, *. The last line made Sarah's breath hitch. "I think he's going to hurt me." Her hands shook as she lowered the paper. Beneath the letter, resting at the bottom of the box, was a small, frayed teddy bear. Its button eyes were missing, its fur worn down to patches. Sarah felt suddenly sick. Daniel exhaled sharply. "What the hell is this?" Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. Why would something like this be inside my wall? Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "This house was built in the 70s, right?" "Yeah." He exhaled. "We need to figure out who lived here before you." Sarah's grip on the letter tightened. Max let out another whine, nudging at the box with his nose. A thought struck her then, one that made her stomach churn. The whisper. The knock. The desperate, pleading voice. Had it been a warning? Or a cry for help? A chill ran through her. Daniel met her gaze, his face grave. "This isn't over," he murmured. And somehow, Sarah knew he was right. It was only just beginning. Sarah barely slept. Even after Daniel left, promising to look into the house's history, her mind refused to quiet. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the letter's words burned into her thoughts. "Please, if you find this, help me." Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the small, frayed teddy bear. Felt the weight of those desperate words pressing against her chest. At some point in the early hours, exhaustion won. But when she dreamed, it was of shadows moving behind walls. The next morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee as it grew cold. Lily chattered beside her, swinging her legs beneath the chair, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside her mother's head. Max lay at Sarah's feet, his body still tense. Every so often, his head would lift, ears twitching toward the living room. Watching. Listening. Then Sarah's phone rang. She nearly knocked over her coffee scrambling for it. "Daniel," she answered. "Tell me you found something." There was a pause. "You're not going to like it?" Sarah swallowed. "Tell me anyway." He exhaled. "The house had a previous owner before you, a man named Peter Calloway. Lived there for nearly 30 years. The name didn't mean anything to her. And he had a son, Daniel said. His voice had a strange weight to it. Michael Calloway. He was 9 years old when he disappeared. Sarah's breath hitched. Disappeared? Daniel hesitated. It was a missing child case. The boy vanished one night in 1981. No forced entry. No leads. Just gone. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. No one ever found him? No. Her stomach turned. Did they suspect the father? Another pause. They never had evidence, Daniel admitted. But there were rumors. People said Peter Calloway was strict, controlling, and after Michael went missing, he became a recluse. He stayed in that house alone until he died 5 years ago. Sarah's fingers curled around the phone. A missing child. A desperate letter. A hidden space inside the walls. Oh God. She turned slowly, her gaze landing on the hole they had opened in the living room. The jagged edges of drywall. The dark space beyond. Daniel. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What? I think he's still here. Daniel was at her doorstep within the hour. He didn't hesitate. The moment he stepped inside, he went straight for the opening in the wall, his jaw set. Sarah hovered near the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Max paced anxiously, his nails clicking against the hardwood. Daniel ran his fingers along the edges of the hole. We need to see how deep this space goes. Sarah's throat felt dry. What if we find something we don't want to? Daniel's expression darkened. I think we already have. He grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the cavity. The light bounced off the wooden beams, casting long, eerie shadows. Then he cursed. Sarah stiffened. What? Wordlessly, Daniel reached inside. Sarah's breath caught as he pulled something free. A small sneaker. Faded. Covered in dust. And undeniably old. A sickening weight settled in Sarah's stomach. Daniel turned the shoe over in his hands, his jaw tight. It's a child's. Sarah swallowed against the bile rising in her throat. They knew the truth now. Even if they didn't want to admit it. Michael Calloway had never disappeared. He had never left the house. He had been here the whole time. The air inside the house felt suffocating. Sarah couldn't stay inside any longer. She stepped out onto the porch, arms wrapped around herself, trying to steady her shaking breath. Daniel followed a moment later, rubbing a hand over his face. We need to call someone. Sarah nodded numbly. Max whined at her feet, nudging his head against her leg. She absently stroked his fur, her mind spinning. She could still hear it. That soft, desperate whisper. Help me. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. Do you think he was alive in there? Daniel's expression twisted. I don't know. Sarah shut her eyes. The thought was unbearable. A small child. Trapped. Forgotten. Left to. She shuddered violently. Daniel reached out, squeezing her shoulder. Hey. His voice was gentle. We'll get answers. Sarah opened her eyes. And if we don't? Daniel didn't respond. Because they both knew the truth. Some questions were never meant to be answered. And some ghosts were never meant to rest. The police arrived within the hour. Sarah stood on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself as she watched the investigators comb through her home. The crime scene tape stretched across her living room like an ugly scar, a stark reminder that the walls of her house had hidden something unspeakable. Lily was upstairs, thankfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding below. Daniel stayed close, his presence the only thing keeping Sarah from unraveling completely. The lead detective, a tall man with tired eyes, approached. Mrs. Carter, we've widened the cavity behind the wall. Sarah's stomach twisted. And? His gaze flickered toward Daniel before settling on her. We found bones? The world tilted. Sarah gripped the porch railing to steady herself. She had known. Deep down, she had known. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Made him real. Michael Calloway had never left this house. He had been sealed inside its walls, alone in the dark, his tiny voice crying out for help that never came. The detective continued, his voice measured. We'll run forensic tests, but given the history, we strongly suspect these remains belong to Michael. He hesitated. There was also something else. Sarah forced herself to look up. What? The detective exhaled. Scratch marks. On the inside of the wood. A sharp gasp tore from Sarah's throat. Her vision blurred at the edges. She felt like she was falling, the weight of horror pressing down on her chest. He had been alive, trapped, fighting, and no one had saved him. That night, silence sat heavy over the house. The police had taken what they needed. The hole in the wall gaped like an open wound, exposing the dark cavity beyond. Sarah hadn't turned on the lights. She sat on the couch, Max curled at her feet, the soft hum of Lily's breathing filtering down from the second floor. She couldn't stop thinking about it. The letter, the bear, the sneaker, the scratch marks. Daniel sat across from her. He hadn't left, and she was grateful for it. He broke the silence first. They'll release a statement soon. Try to piece together what happened. Sarah's throat was tight. We already know what happened. Daniel looked down, rubbing his hands together. Yeah. A beat of silence. Then Sarah whispered, Do you think he knows? Daniel frowned. Who? She swallowed hard. Michael. Daniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. What do you mean? Sarah's eyes flickered to the wall. The knocking, she murmured. The whispering. Max wouldn't leave it alone. What if? Her voice caught. What if it was him? Daniel exhaled sharply. Sarah, I know how it sounds, she cut in. But think about it. That box wasn't just hidden. It was left there. The letter was never meant to be found. And the knocking, it only started after we moved in. Daniel hesitated. You think he was trying to tell you something? Sarah nodded. The thought settled over them like a thick fog. If Michael's spirit had been trapped in that house, if he had been knocking, whispering, pleading, then what would happen now? Now that he had finally been found? Sarah's breath hitched. At that exact moment, Max's head snapped up. His ears perked, his body stiffening as his gaze locked onto the broken wall. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The house was silent. But then, a single, soft knock. From inside the wall. Sarah's heart stopped. She and Daniel exchanged a wide-eyed look, neither daring to breathe. Then, the air in the room shifted. A breeze that shouldn't have been there. A whisper so faint it could have been imagined. Thank you. Sarah's eyes burned. Her breath trembled out of her lungs as the heaviness in the room lifted, like the house had exhaled. Max let out a soft whine before resting his head back down. Daniel swallowed hard. Did you? Sarah nodded. For the first time since moving in, the house felt still. Not empty. Just at peace. Sarah closed her eyes. Michael wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, finally, neither was she.